wanted to put this question to Wendell Pierce. It was a piece that appeared in Chicago by an editorial board member of the Chicago Tribune. Her name is Kristen McCreary. She wrote a piece about Chicago's financial crisis titled, "In Chicago, Wishing for Hurricane Katrina." She wrote, quote, "I find wishing for a storm in Chicago, an unpredictable, haughty, devastating swirl of fury, a dramatic levee break, geysers bursting through manhole covers, a sleeping city forced onto rooftops." She later apologized for offending the city of New Orleans. Wendell Pierce, you're a New Orleans native. Your parents are from New Orleans. Your grandparents are from New Orleans. Can you respond to this and also talk about the struggle for who has made it in the last 10 years in New Orleans and who hasn't? What communities have thrived, and the fact that 100,000 African-American New Orleanians are no longer in New Orleans?
First of all, I found that editorial so offensive. I called it blasphemously evil. For someone to wish for a disaster that killed over 1,800 people as a way to cleanse their city of some sort of political policies that she disagreed with. Not only was the writer offensive and owed the city and all of those who lost relatives 10 years ago an apology, but I can believe that the Chicago Tribune editorial board allowed it to go into print. So that was the thing that was really offensive. And just doubling back on what Gary was saying about the education system, I want you to remember that the United Teachers of New Orleans, the union that my mother was a part of all of her life for 40 years of teaching in the school system, was one of the largest unions and most powerful unions in the state of Louisiana. It was predominantly African-American and women. And when the floodwaters was still rising in New Orleans, one of the first official acts that the governor did was to fire all the teachers. It wasn't by happenstance. It was by design. You saw the political manipulations and taking advantage of the crisis, as it were. And we should not let the education reform that is happening in New Orleans go unchallenged, because just in October of last year, the Cowan Institute at Tulane that put out a study and released data on the progress of the charter school system now actually had to admit that they cooked the books, that they changed the data to make sure that it looked better, because what's happening is a raid of the Treasury, of the money set aside for public education to be given to private companies in education. And they're changing the status quo to make sure that they keep their charters, to make sure that they keep the flow of money coming into the corporation. Remember, the first rule of law when it works in a business or in a corporation is to make a profit. And the only way you make a profit if you're a charter school is to keep that charter. And the only way you keep that charter is to make sure that you give the appearance that you are not failing. And they're leaving a lot of people and a lot of kids on the way, on the side, and they're leaving them in a worse position than they were before if you don't go to the most needy children in your society and help them. As Gary was saying before, they disabled and special needs and special education kids were not having any of their needs met because it is not required in so many of the charters to even have that sort of part in your education system. So a lot of people are being left behind. I have in Pontchartrain Park a community development corporation where we residents initiated our own reconstruction. But as we got the properties that were sold back in the Road Home program in our community of Pontchartrain Park so that we can put them back into commerce. But we are restricted to only selling to low income, 80% average median income and below. I have no problem with bringing in low-income people to the community. That's how my parents got a chance at first getting their first home in the 1950s. But what's happening is to make sure that you displace people who have been forced out of public housing and have only certain areas that they can have access to homes, because then public housing is only one-third public housing anymore. The other two-thirds is now market rate. And it's taken all 10 years to rebuild those public housings. I call it displacement by delay. You know, it took so long for us to even reconstitute public housing in New Orleans that 10 years, if somebody hasn't, you know, placed roots in Atlanta or Texas or wherever they were displaced to, the likelihood of them coming back is very small. So it's by design, it's by policy. You know, I say in my book, my grandparents always taught us, there are those who don't have your best interest at heart. And there are people in positions of power and policymakers who don't have all the city's best interests at heart. And they're constituting policy and taking actions to make sure that only certain communities are coming back and other communities are suffering.
And Wendell, I want to follow up on that in terms of your family in particular, your parents, the struggles that they had to get some kind of assistance and with the insurance companies or with the federal government. And could you bring it home to your own family?
I remember the greatest crime that ever happened, I think, was 10 years ago, where none of the large insurance companies honored the homeowners' policies. My parents paid Allstate for 50 years when they moved into Pontchartrain Park in 1955 up to the day we evacuated. And we're still paying after the flood because my mother said it can burn down at any time. And for those 50 years of premiums, they received $400. They said, that's all we're going to pay. There was a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit years later that everyone participated in to try to get some sort of mediation. And we lost the class action suit. So all of those insurance companies that sold insurance to my parents for years saying that you will be made whole, have some flood insurance, and along with your homeowner's insurance, when you put them together, you will be made whole. They only gave them $400 after 50 years of paying premiums.
What insurance
it's that
company,
sort of crime.
Wendell?
Allstate. Allstate. Yeah, we were in good hands, all right. It's just those hands were squeezing around my parents' neck.
Monique Harden.
Can I add something on the insurance?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
You know, it was interesting, 2005, Katrina, the most expensive disaster in U.S. history. According to the Bloomberg Wire Service, record profits for the insurance companies that year. I think Mr. Pierce just told us why.
And Monique Harden, your own story. Where were you 10 years ago? And talk about the stories of those who were least able to fend for themselves.
Well, my family and I, we evacuated for what we thought would be 3 days in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the nearest place on early Saturday morning that had hotel rooms available. Because between New Orleans, Jackson, other parts, all the hotels, there were no vacancies. So we drove to Birmingham and wound up living there for a couple of months after the storm. I guess the thing for me that I'll never forget, as long as I live, is what it feels like to be displaced, what it feels like to not know whether or not you can come back home again, and how infuriating it is to know that the decision on whether or not you can go back to the place that you call home, the place that's a part of who you are. We don't live in New Orleans, we are New Orleans. Can be decided at the whim of someone who you don't know, who has all of this power as a result of our federal disaster law called the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. I think the reason why things are as bad as they are in New Orleans and why there hasn't been, why the right to return for many people, why the right to recover has been, have both been denied is because there's nothing in the law that protects those rights. And human rights very much are inherent in the right to be able to find your place, live and raise families or make connections and build community. That's all tied to what it means to live with dignity, a human dignity. And not having that and being able to have that in a situation where you need help the most and you're at your most neediest when there's so much devastation all around you. And you're in a situation where you're not with people that you know and you're away from your home is really, you know, we're seeing the repercussions of that 10 years later with, over 100,000 people who are still not back, and for those who are, still living in conditions of displacement. I guess, the thing that is really galling is that the plan, with this discretionary authority under the Stafford Act, you can do a really wonderful thing in terms of rebuilding a community after disaster and ensuring that people have the ability to return and recover and are part of that decision-making and rebuilding process. You can also make really horrific, unjust decisions, and we're living with that right now. And the decision was to make New Orleans whiter and less poor. And what does that look like for a majority African-American city where African-American culture and arts and heritage is very present in this, and it has made the city very vibrant. Since there was in New Orleans, and having that taken away is it creates this really serious human rights crisis that needs a correction. If we continue to send this message of recovery and rebuilding to the world and to the rest of the nation, we're dooming people to live with this kind of scenario after a disaster. And so there's a need for corrective action in terms of ensuring that people are able to recover. As we move forward and out of this 10-year cycle and into the years ahead, that needs to be the focus, that recovery hasn't happened, that the right to recovery needs to happen. And we should not be spending billions of dollars and giving it to people who want to make a city that's majority African-American to be a city that's have fewer African Americans and fewer poor people.
Monique Harden.
It also means that
we're going to break, and we're going to come back to this discussion. Monique Harden is with Advocates for Environmental Human Rights, a New Orleans-based attorney. Gary Rivlin is author of Katrina After the Storm. And actor Wendell Pierce is also an author. His new book, The Wind and the Reeds, A Storm, a Play, and the City That Would Not Be Broken. We'll be back with all of them after break.